My name is Dr. Monique Y. Wells. I am originally from Houston, Texas, and I have lived in Paris since 1992. I was born in St. Elizabeth Hospital, which was in 5th Ward. It's long closed now. My first home was 3rd Ward in Houston, and then when I was 8, we moved south, which at the time the boulevard was called South Park Boulevard, but now it's Martin Luther King Boulevard, and I am in the area of Crestmont Park, which is a little bit south and east of Sunnyside. I made Paris my home in 1992, and I actually moved here not from Houston, but I moved here from the Bay Area, California. I was working for a chemical company in the Bay Area and got a job at a drug company that moved me here in 1992. I was well received in Paris when I moved here in 92. I was hired by a company, so they took care of all of the moving arrangements. They helped me find an apartment. All my paperwork and everything was taken care of. So it was really a fairly easy transition in that sense from a logistical standpoint. From a cultural standpoint, it was more difficult for sure. French people have different ways. Obviously the language is going to be an issue. I spoke French, but I did not have the ear to have fluent conversation easily. So that took a long time to develop. It also took a while to get used to French attitudes. The French are very quick to say no to things, whereas in the United States, we really tend to believe that pretty much anything is possible. Here, it's the exact opposite. You have to sort of prove that it's possible. People think the first thing they say or think is no, that's not possible. So that was interesting for me. One of my sorors, I'm a Zeta, from Zeta Phi Beta sorority. One of my sorors from a very young age, from college, she started going abroad. She worked in Africa. She traveled a lot. And she told me once, she said, the culture shock is more difficult when people dress like you and they eat with a knife and fork and they drive on the same side of the road. She said, when you go to some place like Asia, where you can't read at all because you don't understand the alphabet, and everybody's dressed differently and they eat with sticks, not forks, you expect it to be difficult. But in a place like in Europe, you expect things to be pretty much the same. Even though you know you're in a foreign country, you expect things to be pretty much the same subconsciously. And so when you encounter these little things, it's like a slap in the face, really. and it's exhausting, but it is infinitely rewarding as well. All of the logistical things were taken care of. That was a big hurdle to get over. But then you have to go out into the world and just try to be. And given that I worked full time, so I wasn't, out and about all day, every day. I had my work that was 40 plus hours a week, and then I had the evenings and weekends to explore. And so it takes longer because you're not in it 24/7, so to speak. There was a definite work culture, but the company that I was working for had it was a U.S.-French merger. So, and the U.S. was dominant in the department where I was working. So it wasn't so much of a culture shock for me there, and that was where I was spending most of my time. In total, including the time I was in the U.S., I was in corporate for 13 years. My husband, who was unable to find work in his field, decided that we should start a travel business called Discover Paris, personalized itineraries for independent travelers. And I was still working full time. Our MO for Discover Paris was that we wrote self-guided itineraries for our travelers, our clients, and we wrote a guidebook for them that was specific to their interests. So if you were a person coming to Paris and you had no interest in art, we would not try to get you to go to the Louvre or any other museum, okay? Although people think, well, if you're going to Paris, that's one of the things you must do, whether you care or not. So it was really a unique sort of concept. We learned about it from a woman who had a business with a similar concept in Italy, and we actually sort of molded our business after hers. I was able to write 4 itineraries based on African American presence in Paris because I know and I knew that whenever African Americans travel, they want to know where Black people are, where they were, what they're doing, what they did, where they eat, where they live, all of that. And so I wrote these itineraries, and there were 4 of them, and they were in different parts of the city, and they talked about different eras, if you will, of the African American experience in Paris. And then time went on. The internet became more and more, well, we'll say more widely used. And in conjunction with that, people's attention spans got shorter and shorter. And so what used to happen when we started to work with a client, we had the client fill out a questionnaire, and it was a detailed questionnaire because we wanted to provide a tour that was going to be really specific to you. Well, that took a lot of work. And so as time went on, people stopped they stopped filling out our questionnaire. And that was the only way we could do a self-guided itinerary. So we started to get messages saying, can you take us such and such a place? And it seemed like, in my mind, there was like a switch that was flipped around the time of the Second Gulf War. And I guess people were riveted, people watching TV and the internet all the time. And it was people just stopped asking. So we decided, when we figured out that that was not a fluke, we decided to do guided walks. And sort of for the tours that I had previously written, we took bits of those tours and made them into 2-hour walks. The written itineraries, one could walk all day, literally. But people, again, attention span, etc. And plus Americans don't walk all that much. So we said, okay, we'll do 2 hours and we'll see how that goes. And that worked. And so we continue to do that today. And in 2018, because we got more and more and more requests for Black Paris and fewer requests for anything else about Paris, we decided to rebrand, and we now call ourselves Entrée to Black Paris Tours. How did African Americans discover that there was this Black presence here? It actually dates back to World War I. We had African American soldiers who they enlisted because they thought, okay, we're going to fight in this war and we're going to do well and we'll come home and we'll be accepted. And of course that didn't happen. But they trained many African American soldiers, many African American regiments were sent to Europe, and the government did not want them to fight side by side with white Americans. So they sort of gave over, euphemistically we'll say, gave the troops over to the French. And the French did fight side by side with African Americans in the trenches. And African American soldiers were welcomed into French people's homes. And African American soldiers were decorated for their bravery and their service. And they went home and they talked about this colorblind France. And it's truly a myth. But for them, and let's go a little bit farther. I just said it's truly a myth. For some people, myth is fancy, it's falsehood, it's fantasy. For other people, for other cultures, myth is sacred truth. Okay? Both are true in this instance because France was not and is not colorblind. What France saw in African Americans was American people, first and foremost. And there was this addition because the African American soldiers brought jazz to Paris. And the combination of the demeanor, the behavior of the African American who is welcomed into a white person's home, who is standing side by side in the trenches with white people and being treated as equals, you know, that they could never hope for that on US soil. And then there was the music. And so French people embraced African Americans, and they embraced that aspect of our culture. And when the soldiers went home, they talked about this. That was the beginning of African Americans knowing about France and about the possibility of being treated as an equal there. And so then after the war, some people decided that they wanted to come. So we had a wave of artists who came after the First World War. And then we had the Second World War, and African Americans again were here. They didn't necessarily fight with the French during the Second World War, but they had that First World War experience preceding them, if you will, and they were also treated well. And then afterward, the U.S. Instigated the GI Bill, and so soldiers could go anywhere in the world and study. And so loads of people came here and made a life here. Whether that life was quote unquote permanent or whether it was for a year or 5 years, that was how the whole thing really got started. I would say that the best known musician, although I'm not sure that people would refer to her as such, the best known performer, okay, music, dance, would be Josephine Baker, hands down, hands down. And she came here in 1925. She became an overnight success. And she loved France so much because of the way that it accepted her that she eventually renounced her U.S. citizenship and became French. She did that through marrying a French man, and at that time you could not hold dual. The United States would not allow you to have 2 passports. So she renounced her U.S. citizenship and became French. And that's one of the reasons that she was so easily accepted into the Pantheon in 2021. The French were in a cultural phase of embracing, or at least we'll say admiring, the primitivism of Africa. And Josephine Baker came here at a time when that was sort of at a very high level. And the show that she came here to perform in was called La Revue Nègre. And nègre is the pejorative word that we might think it is in the United States. But the people in that troupe, and she was one of many, they were embraced here. And interestingly, the show, even though it depicted African American culture, the French didn't think it was Black enough. And so they wanted more exoticism, they wanted more of Africa, the continent. And so the show was altered when the troupe got here, and Josephine was chosen to perform in, it wasn't a skit, it was a dance. But she was virtually naked on stage, and so was her male partner. And this is what set the French off, so to speak. So either they were amazed and they loved it, or they were horrified. But regardless, everybody went out and talked about this show, and Josephine was literally catapulted into stardom overnight. And from that time on, all the fashion houses were clamoring to dress her. White women wanted to look like her. It was big. And she was only 19 at the time. She was largely embraced from 1925, which is when she came here, to 1975, which is when she died here. That's a career. You will see photographs of Josephine with a cheetah named Chiquita. And Chiquita, even though you might think the name would signify a female, it was a male cheetah. It was a gift by the head of a theater where she was performing. The cheetah was supposed to be a prop, but she adopted it and she took it home with her, and it shared her bed, her and her lover's bed. And she would walk this cheetah like a dog on a leash. There are photographs of Josephine walking this cheetah on a leash. And they would wear matching jewelry. And it was quite the thing, yes. She had a menagerie. She always had animals. She had multiple monkeys. In addition to just regular dogs and cats, she had a property to the west of Paris that was huge. And she had a big chicken coop. She had, Chiquita was there. When Chiquita would kill a chicken, he would be punished. but you know, what can I say? But she had these animals just all over the house and everywhere. And she would travel with these animals as well. So when she was performing, there would be this small menagerie traveling with Josephine Baker. Just very, very, very interesting. She never lost her love for animals. Is James Baldwin the most impactful? All right, a different generation, so a generation behind Josephine Baker. The two people did know each other. James Baldwin, I think today, given the state of the world today, I think one could say that. But certainly at the time that he was actually here, it was considered that Richard Wright was the most impactful. Okay. And Wright was like a father figure to James Baldwin. Not that they knew each other that well, but just because of Wright's literary prowess and the fact that Wright helped Baldwin get a fellowship when they were both living in New York. Wright was the big man on campus, so to speak, when it came to the African-American writer in the post-World War II era. And Baldwin was up and coming. And so the feeling was that, and Baldwin, actually expressed this, there was no room for anybody else unless Richard Wright was put aside or, I won't say cast away, but this whole idea of only one black person can be in the spotlight at a time. Mm-hmm. And so how can I make myself visible in the shadow of this man? I think in today's time, Baldwin is in everybody's mouth. He's on everybody's mind because the way that he wrote during his time was sort of prophetic for what is happening today. But at the time that he was actually here, and until Richard Wright's death, I would say that Richard Wright would have been the most impactful person. I believe that he believed that he wrote better here. Certainly he felt that he was stifled in the United States and that he could not be free to express himself in the environment that the United States created for black people. So he felt much freer here. In his time, was sought out by French intellectuals. He traveled in philosophical circles here. He was interviewed by the French press. He was the person in that era, but he died in 1960. Okay, Baldwin died many, many years later. And he came in and out of France, whereas Wright sort of made this his home until he died. James Baldwin traveled. He traveled a lot. He spent 9 years here. When he first came in 48, he was here for about 9 years. He did a little bit of traveling during that 9 years, but then he went back to the US. And he physically experienced the civil rights movement. He covered it. He walked with people, And so he had that grounding for his subsequent writings. And I think that in that sense, he is the most impactful person, but not because of the time that he spent here. I think Paris fed his brilliance. I'll say this about brilliance. Brilliance is innate. You're not going to go somewhere and suddenly become brilliant, okay? But environment helps you to bring forth your brilliance. And Baldwin, the first 9 years of his life here, they were a coming of age for him. So he was learning about himself as a black man. He was learning about himself as a gay man. He was learning about himself as an American. He was learning to see himself as through the eyes of people who saw him as a black American and who saw him sometimes as an American before even a black person. That whole concept blows people's mind. It's like the U.S. has painted us all with this brush and we can't step out of it. But blackness here is not as, pun intended, it's not as black and white. So the number one person I would have to talk about with regard to artists who I didn't know about before I came to France and got to know because of my experience in Paris, that would be a man named Beauford Delaney. Beauford was born in Knoxville, Tennessee. He came to Paris via Boston and New York. He was a dear friend and mentor of James Baldwin. And James Baldwin was why I learned about him in the first place, because when I started to write about the travel business, back when it was still Discover Paris, I was wanting to raise awareness about this African-American experience here. And so I started to do freelance writing and blogging. And I wrote an article about African-American grave sites in and around Paris. And I wanted to include James Baldwin because Baldwin did die in France, but he did not die in Paris. I've heard about this man named Beauford Delaney who was really important for Baldwin's life. And because I want to talk about James Baldwin in this article, I'm gonna find out about Beauford Delaney because I heard that he was buried in Paris somewhere. And so I started to investigate and I found out that Beauford was in fact buried in a cemetery that is outside of Paris. It's part of the Paris cemetery system. There are multiple cemeteries that belong to the Paris cemetery system. I'm writing this article, and so I had happened to meet a gentleman who knew Beauford Delaney personally, and I contacted him and I said, might you happen to know where Beauford Delaney is buried? And he said, yes. He said, I've actually visited the grave, but I don't have all the details. Let me find them. I'm gonna contact some other people, and I'll get back to you. So he did that. And he sent an email with the name of the cemetery. It's called Thiais, Thiais, and it's to the south of Paris. You can get there on public transportation, but it is a suburb, it's out of town. And he sent me the information and he said, is Beauford still there? And I said, well, why wouldn't he be there? And he said, well, don't you know that in France, you don't keep your grave forever. There is a sort of a leasing system. And every few years you have to pay, or someone has to pay, to keep your grave intact or they can dig you up. And they're like, there's every possibility that he may not be there. So I go out to the cemetery and I ask, and the woman there says, well, she told me the grave is intact. She was very reticent to give me a lot of information because the French don't like to tell you much that's personal about people if you're not their family. So I was, saying, I'm doing this article. These friends of his have sent me here, and I would just like to go and see the grave and assure them, that it's intact. And if it's going to be exhumed, they would like to know when. And the woman was just very reticent to tell me anything. So I get to the division and I have the row and the tomb number and everything, but nothing is numbered there, and you don't even know where row 1 is, and you don't know which tomb is tomb 1, and there's just no way to orient yourself. So, and I saw that it was one of these paupers divisions, and my heart was just in my throat. And some guards were walking by, and I said, please help me. I said, I don't know how your cemetery works. I have these coordinates. I don't know where I am. You know, is this row 1 or is this row? I don't even know how many rows are in here, because you can't tell, because you can't see stones, you know. And so they were very kind, and they said, okay, madam, you know, you're standing at row 1, and so here's row 2, he's in row 2. And independently, they walked off the tombs, and they both came to a place that had a little ceramic flower arrangement. And again, the weeds were just very tall, up to my knees, literally. And they said, this is it. And I took pictures and I sent them back to the friends. There were 3. One of the gentlemen that I had actually spoken with was in the UK, and the other people were in the United States. And I sent the pictures, and there's like, oh, that flower arrangement is still there. We put that there. So I was like, okay, so that's independent verification that the guards were correct. So by this time, I am emotionally involved, because I've physically been at the grave, and I've seen the horrible condition, and I've seen that there's no stone. And these people are telling me their stories about why this is so important for them to keep this grave intact. And so I said, well, okay, I will inquire. And I said, and understand, they didn't want to tell me what they told me, because I'm not family, but I will inquire. And I had a friend who advised me. And she said, well, Beauford Delaney was an artist, and the French government owns his work. She said, you should write that in your letter, and people will pay attention to you. And sure enough, they did. And so I was given permission to pay the money to keep the grave intact. Less than 300 euros. After 30 years, less than 300 euros. And they were so happy that they said, oh, fantastic, we want to place a stone there. Like, okay. Can you find out? So I go back to the cemetery, and again, they're like, you're not family. You have no rights. But because this man is an artist, and because, you know, the French, when you tell somebody that they're an artist or a writer, ears perk up, they're like, really? You know, they want to know. They want to know about that. So I used that, and I was allowed to place a stone at the gravesite. But it was made clear to me that anytime any family member, no matter how distant, came forward and could prove that they were related to this man, if they wanted to take his remains back to the United States, that was their business. I couldn't do anything about it. We're like, okay, it's been 30 years, we don't think anybody's coming. And in order to raise the money for the stone, which was going to be several thousand euros, I started a French nonprofit called Les Amis de Beauford Delaney, which means Friends of Beauford Delaney. And we raised the money for the stone, and I started to blog about Beauford with a blog of the same name to raise awareness and to, you know, ask people for money. And it took us a few months, but we were successful. We laid the stone the following summer, so the summer of 2010. And in October, we had a ceremony at the gravesite, and the U.S. Embassy sponsored a reception for us in October. The U.S. Embassy did actually support the fundraising effort. They didn't go out and say, you know, give money, but the then ambassador, Charles Ripken, wrote a beautiful letter that was posted on the embassy's website. We were encouraged to refer people to that letter. And they gave us the space to do a reception. So yeah, and I thought, I'm done with Beauford, you know, good job. Preserved a little bit of African-American history in a very tangible way. And I said, okay, I'm gonna stop blogging, I'm gonna go on to something else. And Beauford Delaney was like, no, not yet. You're not finished yet. I'm not finished with you yet. So after about 3 months, I picked the blog up again and just wanting to do whatever I can to explore this man's life in Paris and what brought him here, etc. And when I felt like I had run out of things to say about that, I still felt like I couldn't stop blogging. So I said to myself, well, Beauford Delaney was an artist. Maybe I should look at his art. And so I thought, okay, let's just be very methodical. Let's Google Beauford Delaney and museums, and again, I was not an art person. I mean, I know the names of some museums, but I didn't know really anything about the professional art world. So I just said, okay, I'm gonna look up, I'm gonna say, what are the big museums in the Northeast? What are the big museums in the tri-state area? What are the big museums in the South? Big museums in the North, in the Midwest? And I just sort of Googled names of museums, and then I looked and saw if they had any of Beauford Delaney's work. And it was during that process that I was just looking at the art that I saw, looking at images of it online. And I saw a picture of a painting called Composition 16, which took my breath away. Literally, I was sitting at my desk looking at this image on a computer, and I felt like something had just shot out of the screen and grabbed my heart. And I'm sure that if I had been standing in front of that painting, literally, I would have passed out. That's how strong my reaction was. And I am not an art person. So I'm like, okay, I have been writing about Beauford Delaney for these years, and I have missed the point. I have to go back and look at his life through the lens of his art. And that's what got me started, really looking at his work, which is figurative and abstract, expressionist. And in many, many, many cases, the two blend. So one of the people that he portrayed most on canvas was James Baldwin. Easily a dozen portraits of James Baldwin. Some of them are very figurative. Some of them are bordering on abstraction. And he's done other portraits they're mostly abstract, and you can just sort of see a little bit of a face or something. He was an extraordinary painter. He was absolutely brilliant. And I just feel very fortunate that I have come to know him and his work and the influence that he has had on so many people. The majority of his work, in terms of a public institution, a museum, the majority of his work is found at the Knoxville Museum of Art. And Knoxville is in Tennessee. That is his hometown. I talk about Barbara Chase Reboux in this walk in this garden, in the Luxembourg Garden. I have a walk that is not about a person per se, although there are elements of his personal life in there. But there is a writer named Jake Lamar who came to Paris the year after I did and has stayed just like I have. And he wrote a book called Rendezvous 18th, which is about the 18th arrondissement. And Jake is another brilliant writer. Jake was inspired by James Baldwin. Baldwin is the reason that Jake came to Paris, because when he was a preteen and was learning about Baldwin, the first thing that his teacher told him about James Baldwin was that Baldwin lived in Paris. And so Jake was like, oh. And he's like, had that seed in the back of his mind. And when he received a fellowship, he used the money to come to Paris, and he never left. The Luxembourg Garden, for me, is a very special place because, first of all, because of its history. So we have this garden because of a woman who was Italian, from an Italian noble family. She married into French royalty. She was missing her homeland, and she bought this property from a man called the Duke of Luxembourg. And she built this palace. She's from the Medici family. Her name was Marie de Medici. She's from the Medici family. The Medicis have a homestead outside of Florence, the Pitti Palace, which looks very much like this, or rather this looks very much like the Pitti Palace. She built this to mimic her home. And the Pitti Palace has the Boboli Garden around it, and this garden surrounds her palace. And so even though the landscape here is not like the Boboli at all, but the idea, the garden, is here. And so we have this space, which is my favorite place in Paris because of a woman. And during the course of my time creating walks for Entrée de Black Paris, I think I said we rebranded from Discover Paris to Entrée de Black Paris in 2018. I have been acutely aware of how little women are talked about when it comes to history. And so I'm always digging for women's stories. And there's a lot of women's history, of course. And there's a lot of Black women's history. And this garden has not only a woman to thank for being in existence, but there's a lot of Black women's history in this garden. One of my most popular walks is called Black History in and Around the Luxembourg Garden, women-centric version. Barbara Chase Rebu is part of that walk. Lois Mailou Jones, who is an African-American artist who knew Beauford Delaney, is part of that walk. There are some Afro-French women who are part of that walk. So it's a beautiful space. It has something for everybody. So there's this sort of official area, but if you go to the far side of the garden, it's much more natural, winding paths and groves, and there's even an apiary in the far corner of the garden and an orchard, and they do beekeeping back there. There are little places, and then there's a huge place for kids to play. There's just something for everybody here. So it's official, it's regal, and the French Senate happens to meet in the Luxembourg Palace, so this is an important space for government. And the government has had a lot to do with contemporary events here. For example, the French Senate unanimously passed a law that declares slavery and the slave trade crimes against humanity. They meet here. A Black man was at the helm of the French Senate for over 20 years here after the Second World War. So it has everything. So if I had to summarize, I guess what you're asking me is to summarize my life. Born and raised in Houston, Texas, living in Paris, France, a couple of little stops in between. I will never willingly leave this place. I plan to die here. I think that Paris is, at least for me, a place where anyone can discover self and can discover the world all in one space, surrounded by beauty, surrounded by cultures from around the world. This place is truly a melting pot. As much as we talk about a melting pot in the United States, Paris has every person, a representation of every culture in the world here. And it's in a much smaller space, so you can experience it up close and personal. And I call Paris a feminine city. It has a feminine energy for me. I think women will feel easier moving to a place like Paris than they would to a place like New York or even London. Certainly there have been some very, very strong women who have come from France. And while that's true, I think, of everywhere, I think the energy that you step into when you want to look at women's history and women who are doing things contemporarily, I think the feminine energy augments that. I just think it's an easy place to be.